Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Jim Conti, talent partner at Hyde Park Venture Partners. In this role, Jim provides strategic talent support and consulting to the firm's portfolio of companies. Prior to Hyde Park Venture Partners, Jim served as head of people at Dscout and Sprout Social. In those roles, Jim built, grew, and oversaw teams across recruitment, talent management, DEI, culture, HR, and benefit strategy. And the impact of this work was seen in awards from Glassdoor, Chicago Tribune, Chicago Cranes, Built in Chicago, and many others. This was a fun conversation. I feel like I say that all the time, but it was a fun conversation. One of the things that I like to do with the show is look at extreme examples and then pull out the lessons that the general population can learn. Because I think in the extremes, things become a little bit clearer. And then you can take those clear lessons and apply them to your general day-to-day. And so in this, we're talking with Jim, who works at Hyde Park Venture Partners. They are a venture capital company. They are investing in pre-seed to Series A startups. And that startup world can be very specific, very cutthroat, move very fast. There's just a lot that's happening in there that I think we can pull lessons from. And so while we're talking about how Jim consults with the leadership of the portfolio companies of his VC firm, the lessons that he's talking about apply just as much to a 1,000-person business or a 10,000-person business. How you build a team, how you come and show up as a leader, how you treat your people, the way you recruit, the way you interview, all this stuff that we're going to be talking about in here is really applicable anywhere. So excited to share this with all of you. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you pull something out of it. As you'll hear, I definitely changed my way of thinking in a few different areas. I hope it does for you too. Enjoy Jim Conti. Jim, welcome to the show. Excited to have you on and talk about all things venture capital today. This will be a fun topic we haven't covered on the show, so welcome.
Yeah, thanks, O'Brien. Glad to be here today.
So let's just start at the beginning, as I like to do sometimes, and would love to understand what is Hyde Park Ventures and what is your role there?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So Hyde Park Venture Partners is a venture capital firm headquartered in Chicago. Our investment thesis looks to check 3 boxes before we dive further into diligence with a potential company. So first, we have a geographic focus. We look for at least one founder of that company to be based in the US Midwest, Toronto, or Atlanta. I'll remix that a little bit to say we focus on regions and metros that have traditionally been underserved by the coastal funds and found that we've had great experience supporting founders and entrepreneurs that are in those regions. And so we deeply believe that there are great and very valuable companies that are being built. And that's where we want to continue to focus moving forward. Second, we're early stage investors. So we're cutting a first check somewhere between the pre-seed to early A rounds for a team. Note that I said first check. Ideally, we are installing multiple checks across a company's growth trajectory. We're not just a VC that operates at one specific point in time, but once we've made an investment, we're a partner through whatever that process ultimately unfolds to be. Third, we're technology investors. Most of our investments are traditional SaaS, marketplace, or tech-enabled service companies, so real focus on software. But we have a couple of things in the portfolio outside of that. We have a robotics company, a quantum computing company, a couple other things that are outside of pure software. So I'll say technology to be safe, but most of what we invest in is software. We've been around for about a dozen years at this point, operating out of our 3rd fund. I think that that's important because especially when I mentioned that geographic focus, folks often kind of react and say like, oh, cool, that must be a recent transition, or as people kind of moved in the midst of the pandemic or something like that. No, we've been investing in the region that we focus on for a very long time and are very deeply entrenched here. And so if anything, the COVID period only proved more that we have a thesis that we continue to believe in and will continue to operate from. At this point, we have about 60 companies in the region that we have invested in and are continuing to support as they are continuing to grow. My role is relatively new at the firm, though. So I joined up in the summer of 2021 in this talent partner capacity. Previous to that, the team had mostly been investors. So folks that were out in the world interacting with founders, once they made the decision to invest, sitting on board, supporting those founders as they were growing their business. What the team reflected on is that the number 1, 2, and 3 questions they got were about talent-related things, recruitment, HR, benefits, and that the team, while trying to be helpful, was not their deep keel. And so they created this talent partner role that I ultimately got to step into. And so my work today is a balance of what I describe as kind of 2 primary buckets. First is HR consulting with a portfolio, directly working with our founders, functional leaders, and heads of HR to think through people-related questions that they have as they're building their business. The other part of what I do is I manage networking community for the firm. So I manage relationships with anyone outside of peer investors at other VC firms. So think of service providers and vendors, subject matter experts in our advisor network, candidates that might be looking to make a job move. Anyone in those types of buckets are folks that I get a chance to interact with on a daily basis as well.
Fantastic and very thorough. Thank you very much for that. So I know you're not on the investment side.
Correct.
And I know we've talked about that before, but I do have a couple questions on that. I'd just be curious your perspective as a people leader. Like if anyone wants to know what makes somebody invest in a pre-seed company, like you can go watch Shark Tank and there's a bunch of episodes on there on what they look for in a business. But I think from the people side of a business, the name of the show is People Business. Is there anything that you or that the firm looks for when making an investment when it comes to the people? And that could be the founders or their employees or any way you want to take that question. But is there anything that you look for when making investments when it comes to human capital?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great question. And, from my perspective, previous to this role, I was at 2 venture-backed companies that were headquartered here in Chicago as a first head of people for both. And so I'll be honest that I probably came into the role with a little bit of an ego of like, I've been at 2 venture-backed companies. I've worked with about a dozen VC firms at this point, been through 6-7 rounds of funding. Like I understand how this works. I didn't. It has been a wildly interesting learning experience since I've been here in a way that I'm really appreciative of. The mindset that the firm had when I came in, and it's one that I really appreciate and that I am proud to kind of align myself with, starts with the founder when we talk about people in a business. And specifically the way the team has talked about it and the way that I've really acclimated to is the concept of the match between the founder or founding team and the problem that they're trying to solve. What is it about this person or this team that really makes them specifically positioned to be successful in building a business that's going to win in the space? That could come from a bunch of different areas. And I look at our portfolio and see examples of all different kinds of examples here of what that means. It could be that the person has professional experience, that they have worked in the space before, identified a challenge that they had and are now building in that capacity. It could be that they had a personal experience, that something happened in their personal lives with their family or loved ones that informed kind of some part of their personality, some part of their knowledge base that makes them uniquely positioned to kind of tackle something. Their own lived experience, all sorts of different ways that could manifest and play out. But that was firmly in place with the firm before I got here as part of our kind of diligence process is understanding what is the connection of this founder or founding team to the problem that they're trying to solve. And that has been really interesting to me. One of the other parts that we look at, particularly at the stage that we're investing at in that pre-seed, seed, early A, you typically are working primarily with the founding team. They might have like one layer of employees. I typically describe that group in that stage as friends, family, former coworkers, right? They haven't necessarily gone out and actually recruited people into the business, but rather brought those people on that were kind of those initial cheerleaders and helped them build out the initial foundation of the team. We look a lot at whether or not we think that the founder and founding team will be able to build the organization that is necessary to win in that space. I frame it that way because, especially in today's world, you have these fields that are in the midst of coming out of the ether that haven't existed before. So whether that's all of the work happening in AI right now, whether that is quantum computing, whether that is international trade and commerce and stuff like that there are all of these kind of different areas that are coming out and that there aren't necessarily a lot of professionals in that area. So do we think this founder is going to be able to recruit the team that they need to be able to win in the space? The last thing that I would say is, especially as we are getting a little later in the stages with our companies, I get pulled into a lot of conversations looking at executive and leadership teams, whether or not we are at a point where that team is going to be able to continue to scale at the pace that they need to based on competitors in the space, based on how quickly things are evolving or changing. It can kind of manifest a couple of different ways, but whether or not those leaders are those that are going to be able to kind of really carry the business forward and partnering with founders or CEOs to think through that process, kind of do that org assessment, that leadership assessment, and partnering with them to kind of think about that. So people are a massive part of our decision-making process to invest initially and the ongoing conversation we have with our portfolio companies to think about whether or not they have the team needed that to be able to succeed, to win in the space that they're in.
Let me say this back to you and just see if this is fair recap of kind of what you just said. When you're looking at making investments in businesses and you're looking at the leaders, the founders, and one, do they have some sort of skill set, expertise, something that's going to make them specifically able to solve that problem.
Yeah.
So they need to be aligned to solve the problem they're trying to solve.
Correct.
And then it sounds like you're also saying that they need to be aligned with some sort of interpersonal skills to be able to build a team around themselves, maybe have the humility or the perspective to solve problems with a group of people.
Yeah. Is
that fair?
I would add into the second. So the first point, 100%. Yes.
Okay.
Second point, I would add in that there's also an element of like an awareness on that founder's part. If they aren't someone that has that ethos, gravitas, like insert word that you kind of want there from a team building perspective, the awareness that they don't have it, which is fine. Particularly folks that maybe are coming from a highly technical background might not have that as much as folks that are coming from background where they have to be more extroverted and in front of folks. At least if they have the awareness of that and can interact with, get on board folks that do have that and can maybe take a bit of that mantle, we're okay with that too. But there is definitely a little bit of a balance in there of like, do you have that gravitas to be able to build the team around you? And that's going to be, could be the whole team, could be at least a few of your key leaders who can take that mantle for you as well.
Okay. So is it fair then to say you don't have to be able to do everything as the leader, but you do at least have to have the humility and self-awareness to recognize your weaknesses and bring in and ask for help to fill those gaps?
100%. I love that you're using the word humility here in terms of what you're hearing me say. I think that's a really good word to apply to what I'm talking about here. I would say that when things get tough with a founder within our portfolio, what I often see my investment team doing is really leaning into that feedback and looking for them to be open to guidance, direction. Let us introduce you to someone that's been through this moment before, help you build perspective on this. And that's a real low ego moment for a founder, right? You have to really be able to step back from having too much of I'm going to go back to the word ego again here, but like too much of an ego in the situation to be able to accept help or to recognize that you're not going to be perfect or great at everything. And that you are open to learning, that you are open to getting that feedback, helping build that perspective so that you can make that informed choice. I think the last thing that I'll add in here, though, is that I have also been really impressed with, again, I came into my investment team having this mindset or methodology, is that given the stage that we're investing at initially, we are typically investing, as I said in that first point, as we've chewed on in that first point, the founder themselves or the founding team themselves is those that we think can win in the space that they're building in. And so with that in mind, we often then default to them making those choices for their business. So there is a balance there of like that humility to take that feedback or direction or help build perspective, but also the confidence to be able to make a decision and move forward. And so there's a balance in there, and you need to make sure that it is truly the balance of those two things, not one or the other kind of pushing too hard.
Yeah. And that totally aligns with other conversations I've had on this podcast. So in the first 6 months of doing this show, I interviewed a CEO, a Navy SEAL, a FBI hostage negotiator, and I think one or two others who all keyed in on the importance of humility and the point that you just made, which is that a high level of humility does not mean a low level of confidence.
Correct.
You can have the two at the same time. And the Navy SEAL who I interviewed, his name was Mike Sorelli. We shared a virtual space, right? And he was the most confident person I think I've ever been around. I mean, you could feel his confidence, right? He was somebody who was totally sure of himself. And yet he could not have been a more gracious, humble guest on the show and was not arrogant at all in the conversation we had. And it was really something to spend, again, even just that virtual space with somebody like that. And so I think you see that at an extreme level there, but I've been paying more and more attention to that balance since those first 6 months of doing this, and just really that importance. And we see it in the business I'm in, where everybody who comes into the sales role that I have, they have to change something. There's always an adjustment to make. When you step into a new company, you step into a new role, there's always an adjustment you have to make. And we're a really high performance organization. And so it can be really easy to get in that inflated ego and get kind of the defensive ego and say, no, I can do this. I need to perform. I know what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, the people who perform the best are the people who come in and say, okay, what do I need to learn here? And how do I make these adjustments as fast as I can? And I know what I'm doing. I'm going to go out and I'm going to be confident in this, but I also recognize I'm going to have to do things differently. So all that to say, I've seen exactly what you're talking about in a lot of different areas. And I think if there's a skill set we can all be building, it's that balance between humility and confidence.
Exactly. And I think self-awareness is a primary key across both of those pieces. And self-awareness is not something that is born purely from self, which is odd given the name. It's something that is often built through the conversations and relationships we have around us. And so for founders especially, but really any executive in the world, you should constantly be building your network so that you have a variety of people that you can tap into to help build your perspective, build your knowledge base, be able to think through a challenge, a problem. And specifically for your early stage companies, you're probably the top of the stack for that function within the business. You might not have other leadership peers to kind of tap into. And so really having that network to be able to tap into and say, like, how have you solved similar problems before? What does that look like for you? What did you learn through that process? That is something I think is an incredible skill to be able to ask those questions, but it comes with that ability to build the network that you can tap into to do that as well.
I think that insight made the whole podcast right there. We could just stop now because I love the way you said that. The fact that self-awareness does not start from inside. It starts from the outside. I think that could not be more right on right now. And I'm actually working with somebody to help them with their own self-awareness right now at work. And that's exactly it. We're helping this person shine a light from the outside on what's going on so that they can then be aware of how their behavior is impacting other people. So yes, and yes, totally agree. So let's flip it over then. You make the investment, you get engaged. What are the common pitfalls that people are making, or what are the common misconceptions that leaders have that you kind of have to help them with right out of the gate?
Yeah. My brain goes in a couple of different directions with this one. I think one of the first is the reality that in a venture situation, typically a venture investment is being installed to unlock some sort of growth opportunity for the business. At the stage we're investing at, and part of the reason why my role came to be, is that it's unlocking the ability to hire team members or bring on contractors or add additional people to the team to be able to accelerate growth, right? Later stages, it might be a little bit more about like the ability to make an acquisition or a further, kind of demand generation spend or something like that. But at our stage, it's typically really anchored to hiring people. And so it can be a misconception that when those dollars are the check is wired, so to speak, that you then immediately go and hire the next 5 people that you meet, right? That is the very natural process. There probably should be a few team members that you're thinking about hiring very quickly after the check is wired. But that is a process that I would encourage folks to be very calculated with, very clear about what it is they're adding to the team, what those additions are going to do to the organization. Whenever you add someone new, there's always going to be impacts that are had across the board. I think that when we reflect back on a bit of what's happened within the markets, you kind of look at that, say, tail end of 2020 to start of 2022 period with just how many venture dollars were being deployed and how rapidly few people were moving across the talent market. One of the common conversations I find myself at now with executives that are looking for a next opportunity that have maybe experienced a RIF or layoff or have recognized that the company that they joined doesn't have the financial stability that they were looking for. One of the key pieces I see is folks trying to understand, like, what is the judiciousness that a founder, a CEO, a finance leader is thinking about the dollars that the business has and where those dollars are going to be able to go. And so kind of back to your core question here, when an initial investment is made, one of the early conversations I'll have with those founders is like, great, what is this unlocking for you? Like, what is this putting out into the world that we're able to go and chase after now? I try to keep a keen eye on what roles they are kind of bringing in and what are the impacts that those roles are thought to have. If the founder or CEO hasn't thought through really thoroughly, at least high level KPIs, metrics, goals that this person or these people or this team would help them to achieve, that's usually a pretty big red flag for me. If they don't understand what the impact of hiring a first head of marketing is going to be, that's something that gets me a little bit nervous. And so back to the conversation we were just having around self-awareness or perspective building, that's a big place where I do a lot of intros that are not about candidate intros, but perspective building intros, giving our founders a chance to be able to talk to a sitting head of marketing. What does that person's profile look like? And what are they able to achieve for the team? What do those first few months on the role look like? That's often where I find my initial conversation sitting is a little bit on like org design and headcount and like, what do we need to go hire right away? But a lot on perspective building, helping founders think through what are the right next choices to make and making sure that they have the information, knowledge, people to be able to do that. So that's a big part of it. And where I'd see, kind of pitfalls is kind of that deployment of capital too quickly. I think on the other side, there is how would I describe this? A need to move quickly enough because most startups are in a competitive space where they have other peers out there that are trying to kind of do somewhat similar things, or there's bigger players in the space that are creating additional features in their existing platforms to tackle, something that a startup is building as well. So I will talk out of both sides of my mouth to say it's also moving fast enough when that capital is deployed and making sure that we are not letting it just sit in indecision of what we're going to do, but rather, again, building perspective on what those pieces are. I would typically say that it's very similar to a roadmap, right? Like, kind of think that we need these first few pieces in place, whether those are full-time hires, contractors, freelancers, project-based folks, consultants, to be able to help us unlock that next mystery that's on the horizon and then continue to plan from there. I would encourage a founder to scenario plan and assume that, like, cool, we go through this first step. There are one of 2, 3, 4 outcomes that might come here. And here's what plans look like for each of those outcomes. So it's not that you're not planning ahead or you're not taking action. It's trying to do both at the same time. Operate in the near term to be able to get you to that next milestone, but thinking about what versions of that milestone might look like to be ready for when that happens, that you actually have some version of a plan in place already as well. Those are the situations I would say I feel the most confident walking away from a conversation with a new founder, that they are thinking not just about what needs to happen this week, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, but rather the full trajectory of the business. But also not only thinking about full trajectory of the business, like what are the pieces that need to be in place to get there too?
Yeah. Well, one of my beliefs is the answer is always in the middle. And so if anyone's like,
right? Yep.
We got to run fast. It's like, well, the answer is probably in the middle. We got to run steady. We got to be steadily moving forward, and we need to be thoughtful in how we do it. We don't need to be too thoughtful in how we do it, but we do need to be thoughtful in how we do it. Yeah. That's a belief that over time has just solidified for me, is the answer is usually in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would agree with you.
I want to talk about building out executive teams and building out an employee base, but let's start maybe with the executive team, since those are some of the key people. What advice do you have for leaders who are looking out to build a team? Maybe they already have a team, but they're looking to build other leaders within that team. What are the values you should be looking for? What are the ways you should be evaluating that talent? How should people think about this?
Yeah. So my first thought goes to the fact that, like, culture in an organization is a living, breathing thing, right? It is made up by the collective of individuals who are there as they come in, as they depart. It will continue to evolve. And so any response I have here has to come with the fact that it has to be adaptable. Like, you have to be flexible as things continue to evolve. That said, I will also argue that an organization should have a continuous North Star that they're marching towards, clarity of mission, vision, values, clarity of company cultural milestones or key belief systems, whatever that is. And so that's, I would argue, the best of those that I've seen are made from a mix of the founder or founders and their belief system. Why did they start this company in the first place? And the team members that they're adding across time. And so whether you are continuing to evolve that through things like engagement surveys or various brainstorming activities kind of across time, making sure you're reflecting on whether or not these values are still our values, still reflect who we are today, is really important.
Is it fair to say, I mean, it feels like the simpler, the better with that?
For the most part, I will agree. I think that where I see challenge with simple is it can replicate what you've seen elsewhere, right? And so I feel like there have been any number of startups that have adopted the Facebook/Meta motto of, like, build quick and fail fast, or whatever the phrase is. And I don't know that that's necessarily the right one for a lot of companies to live by. I don't know that Facebook even lives by it now anymore. You saw a lot of companies talking about that. And so, like, where's the differentiator in there? I do agree with simple, but it has to be accurate, has to be reflective of who you are as an organization. And it has to be able to differentiate you, particularly from a recruitment perspective, as you are going up against, insert any number of other startups who have similar catchphrases that they're using, and or the bigger tech players who probably have potentially a better definition of what those words mean. So yes, but I think there has to be a layer of making sure that it stays unique, stays differentiated within that as well.
And authentic.
Yes. Great word to add here.
Yeah. Because people can smell bullshit. And if they come in and they, you've sold them on a bunch of values, and then they get in and day one, they see the exact opposite. People can see through that very quickly.
Yep. Quick.
And they are paying attention. You may think they're not, but they're paying attention.
Totally. Quick anecdote on that. I think that what's been really interesting to see across the pandemic period is the proliferation of virtual interviewing, right? That you are fully interviewing with a company over a phone and some sort of video platform, Zoom, Google Hangouts, otherwise, something like that. And then it might be not until your onboarding experience or sometime past the onboarding experience, we actually meet your team members in person. I was talking to a marketing leader based in our region here. She took a job with a San Francisco-based company, went through a full virtual interview process, and they asked her, sign an offer. Everything seemed great. She was super excited. They asked her to come out for her first week of onboarding. So day one was going to be in the office in, I think it was San Francisco, but it's somewhere in the Bay. I think it was San Francisco. She agreed. She thought it was a great idea. Gets out there. As I was talking to her, so this is a couple of months after this experience happened, she told me, she was able to retell the story that within the first 15 minutes in the office, she knew that she had made a mistake. She knew that it was not the right choice for her. And I was like, tell me a little bit more about that. And she just described a couple of things. One was just the way that the office was set up, that it was a buzzer to get in. And as you had to get buzzed in, and when you walked in, there was no welcoming environment. And she's like, it's not like I was expecting a receptionist or something like that. It's a small company, but you came in, it was just cold. It was sterile. She described it as just this very gray, blank environment. And she's a marketing leader. So she's like, I need a little bit of something here. And then just some of the other things that happened, there was a whiteboard that had some sort of a phrase on it of like, erase this and I'll kill you or something like that, like real just guttural language. And she's like, that's not how I speak to my peers. And I don't want to be in an environment where my peers speak to me like that. All of these very small things that kind of came into this. And so she kind of described how she tried to accept that in those first few minutes and just be like, cool, I just need to kind of get past this and like, we'll figure it out. But as she started working with the team, she saw that that's how they interacted, very kind of cold, very almost taking pot shots at each other. And she was like, it was just not the environment that I wanted to be in. And so what we were reflecting on is this ability for companies to be able to have this very crisp, very clean interview process, but that for particularly executives, but I would really say candidates across the board, that you need to get a layer below that, right? Like you need to get a layer deeper to make sure that there is that alignment of those values or cultural pieces, cultural artifacts that you're going to be looking for in that next opportunity. And that in the virtual environment that a lot of us still exist in, it's a really hard thing to actually be able to achieve. And so I've seen some cool resources out there for candidates on the market to be able to ask more meaningful questions or be able to get kind of under the covers a little bit more. Basically, one of the places that I kind of go in this, and then we can kind of get back onto the values piece and building executive teams we were chatting about. But one of the pieces of advice I've had for candidates that has resonated with folks is remembering all that we've learned about being interviewers and applying that as an interviewee, right? So the same kind of assessment that we do when a candidate gives us a response of whether you use the STAR method or something else to be able to kind of work through that interview process, doing that as a candidate as well and making sure that you're getting all of that information, asking for multiple examples rather than just the surface level example that comes first. Making sure that you are talking to a large enough swath of the team to be able to build that perspective, not just your peer leaders if you're coming into that leadership team, but rather members of your team, maybe peers or folks that you would be working with on other departments as well. And just making sure that you have as much information as possible to make that informed choice about where you want to land next. Got a little on the side of recruiting here. Didn't mean to do that.
No, that's great. That's great. And I think it's important. And just one thing I'll add to that is I was interviewing another woman on the show and we were talking about interviewing and making sure you don't get into a bad position. And the question that she recommended that I thought was great was, what do you look like on your worst day? Or what is, in this case, what does this environment look like on its worst day? And you'll get people be like, well, it's, on its worst day, this happens. And, I think you get to a pretty good view of that. And then it's okay, well, how often does that happen? Well, not very often. And it really is a good place to work. And you'll experience it. And it's like, okay, well, maybe I don't want to be in that environment.
Yeah. And that's where you got to have your bullshit meter on patrol here. Cause it's like, if someone's like, oh, we don't have bad days here. And if we do, we get together at the end and it's fine. It's like, no, that's not reality. Like we've all been, even those of us that have the most practiced and kind of clear sense of self and like who we want to be in every scenario, we can't be perfect in every scenario. So like, let's get an honest answer here on the table and like actually talk about that. So I love that.
Yeah. I've done way more self-development work than 99% of the population and I screw it up all the time. So, there's bad days everywhere.
Bad days for everyone. Yeah. Well, I want to bring us back to your starting question that got us into a little bit of a tangent here. Because the last thought I wanted to kind of add in, and I think it's relevant to what we're chatting about here, is that as we're building executive teams, one of the places where I've seen a real kind of success strategy, maybe is the right word we'll use here, is it's got to be that balance of kind of values alignment to the business with functional expertise. If you index too far one way or the other with an executive, I think that can be a real failure mode, right? Someone that is wildly values aligned, but they don't have the functional ability to actually do the thing that they're hired to do, versus they are wildly good at the functional thing that they can do, but they could care less about the business or about the culture and they aren't investing in that. especially for an early stage business. Your leaders are going to be talking to potential customers, talking to potential candidates, talking to potential investors constantly. And so you have to have great confidence that they're able to balance both of those things, show their functional expertise, but with that values alignment to the business, and be able to win over insert person, insert stakeholder in front of them to be able to win as an overall company. Because you as the founder or CEO or founder group can't possibly, as you continue to scale, manage all of that. And I think that, I reflect on my own experience as an HR leader at early stage companies, the different moments with the two companies I was at, but that moment where I recognized that the CEO really trusted me as a recruitment leader to be able to manage that conversation and manage that messaging with candidates, whether at, kind of an entry level point or an executive level point, that was where I was like, oh, cool. They actually trust me to do this. They're kind of giving me those Legos, handing them over a little bit, which was always a moment of great pride for me.
Yeah. So you use the word trust there. And I was talking with somebody this morning who's a listener. Shout out, Carrie, if you're listening to this. And we were talking about building trust on a leadership team. How do you help, or how do you advise leaders or leadership teams to be building the right level of trust so that they are communicating appropriately, fighting appropriately, able to move the ball in a healthy manner and build from a healthy platform? Because I think that is really critical, that a team, leadership team or any team, has that level of trust, because you're going to have bad days. You're going to have disagreements. There's 1,000 things that are going to come up that need to be worked through. And I believe trust is the foundational level that allows you to then hash that stuff out. You could disagree with that, or if you do agree with that, how do you help teams or advise teams to be building that in the right way from the beginning?
Two words I come to as like initial everyday expectations: vulnerability and modeling. So vulnerability being that you are sharing of your own mind and your own experience as is real, as is honest in the moment. We were just talking a little bit about, what does it look like on your worst day kind of thing. And to show up every single day with a smile on and a chipper attitude, that can be accurate for some people in the world. For most of us, that's not how we show up every day. There's stuff that happens in our personal lives that impacts it, or you lose a deal at work that was, something that was really meaningful to you, and that makes things harder moving forward. That vulnerability to be honest about what's going on feels really important to be able to show up and share with others. But I want to make sure I'm putting a block on this, or a wall on this, or a limit on this. It does not mean dumping your bucket. Vulnerability does not mean coming and just sharing like, here are all of the things that have happened in the last 24 hours for me. Okay, you go. That's not what it is, because that is putting a lot of onus and pressure on the person that you're talking to, or the group that you're talking to manage your life or your emotions for you. And that's not what we're asking for here. So it is finding the right balance of like, what is appropriate to bring into the conversation and share, and then creating space for others. And that's where the modeling word comes in, right? So modeling means that you are showing what it means to do that, and then creating the space for others to do the same, as is their comfort level. I would argue that as a leader, you're going to have to index a little bit more on the vulnerability side and share a bit more about yourself and what's going on in your world to model that for your team members. And then as the team members become more comfortable and start to trust you a bit more, they will start to share little bits, and they will be looking to see how you respond to that. And so as your team members do show that they are trusting you more, you need to respond in kind and trust them in response, be respectful of that, be at times deferential to that, whatever the right word be at the time. But I think that that's where it starts. So that's kind of the day-to-day stuff. At the same time, especially if you're building in a remote environment, I do think that it is really important to find moments to bring the team together in person as much as possible, to be able to build those bonds more specifically with each other. So whether that is quarterly retreats, or you have in-office days, or like whatever it looks like for you, I think that what's really important is that the focus in those settings is really about relationship development and not necessarily about work getting done, right? I think one of the big failures I've seen in the push to bring people back into offices is that you have this RTO push, you put out a lunch for people in the middle of the day. Sure, great, wonderful. But the rest of their day, they're sitting in call rooms on Zoom calls. Well, that's what they could do at home. There's no meaning being built there. There's no relationships being built. And so while you are having the vulnerability and modeling happening on a day-to-day basis, when you do have those moments that the team is together, you really focus on making sure that we're talking about building relationships with each other, being able to engage in conversations that are much harder to have virtually, and having that time feel very meaningful for people as they are building relationships with each other.
I love it. I want to risk going down one other rabbit hole here because I like what you said about vulnerability not being about dumping your whole bucket out. Mm-hmm. And this may sound controversial, but we hear people talk about, oh, we want you to bring your whole self to work. And I always it just makes me a little uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't want people to bring their whole selves to work. Mm-hmm. I want them to bring their authentic selves to work. I think that's great. But you don't need to bring all of it all the time. Like, some of it you can leave behind, and that's great and probably healthy for you and for us. How do you respond to that? Is that okay? Feel free to push back, because I know a lot of people tout, bring your whole self to work. I sort of view the vulnerability piece of it and the authenticity piece of it kind of the way you said, like, hey, we want the authentic you, but we don't want you to just like come dump your whole bucket on us. Like, you're an adult. You should be able to take care of yourself to some capacity.
Yeah. A couple of places my brain goes. And first, I want to give a shout out to Erin Thomas, who leads diversity, equity, inclusion work at Upwork. She's a good friend of mine here in Chicago, and someone who has really helped me push my thinking on this topic. So I love that you're asking about it. One of the things that she talks a lot about is this concept of being able to bring your whole self to work comes with a bunch of other expectations on managers, leaders in the business to create a psychologically safe workplace for someone to even entertain that idea. And so she can speak volumes on this way better than I can. But at its core, I do agree with you, and is something that I buy into. I think we're for me, it maybe in terms of like quick response here, it's a little bit of the choice process, right? If you're making an all or nothing choice to bring full self to work, like that isn't going to work. That is not how most people want to interact with their jobs or the world around them. So I think it's a choice of how much of yourself you're bringing to work, how much you want to share, and how much kind of shows up. I think where I hope, I guess I'll riff off a little bit of your point on this authentic self. I'm hopeful that we are continuing to build more human-centric workplaces where people can feel like they can bring the parts of themselves that are not part of the workplace, but help to explain who they are in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And so, whether that is for a new parent who is experiencing life at home with a newborn for the first time, and that for anyone that has gone through that experience is a wild journey. And so being able to either connect with other parents on the team or being able to just share about that with peers that don't understand it, but who are going to create space for them to just talk a little bit about it because it is new and it's different and it's going to impact their ability to show up at work every day. Could be in the vein of, I think about vulnerability. I'm going to bring back the vulnerability concept here. One of the big unlocks I've seen from as it relates particularly to the LGBTQIA community is that leaders who speak about their friends or peers or siblings or themselves, but, kind of thinking about kind of broader community here, who identify within that community and being able to share some of those persons' stories in the appropriate context within the organization can be really helpful for someone who might still be in the closet to feel comfortable to come forward or just maybe it's not even coming out necessarily, but just being more of themselves in the workplace and understanding that that'll be something that is celebrated and not punished and that kind of thing. Yeah. I think the last thing, and I'm going
to... Well, just real quick, not punished is a big part of that too, right? For any of this stuff, like that you can be whoever you want to be and not be punished. I think that's a big part of what people are trying to get at when they say bring your whole selves to work.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And I think that it going back to the vulnerability concept yet again here, and it's it's being able to share of yourself as is relevant as well. I think that, I've had a couple of conversations in my personal life where folks have been, put into a setting in some sort of like a teen retreat environment where one of my friends was telling me that they were asked to share, I'm going to forget the exact phrase of the question here, but something like, share the hardest moment of your life or something like that. And they're like, I don't want to relive that. Like, why would you possibly ask me that at a work retreat? Like it was understood in the context of trying to build relationships and being vulnerable. But my friend was kind of just reflecting. She was like, I don't want to talk about that. Like, it's not that it's not part of me. It's not that it's something I don't, want to talk about, but like not in this setting. Like that's not where I want to kind of bring it up. So vulnerability has to come with a choice to be vulnerable. And especially as I'm guessing a lot of the listeners here are kind of coming from the people in HR space, we as HR leaders have to create spaces to encourage that to happen to some extent, but it can't be required. I think the requirement on that feels really uncomfortable to a lot of people. And so, I think that that's a good question to ask here. I love the authentic self that you brought up here, O'Brien. I think that that's a good kind of reframe or way to think about it versus the full self, which can be something that can truly be dangerous to people.
Yeah. And you know what? I want to add one more caveat, because as I said that, and as you're talking, I realized it sort of shifted my thinking a little bit on this. This is why I like doing this podcast. Because I've had days at work where I'm not bringing my best self to work because something's going on at home, something's going on in my family, some tragedy has happened, something like that. And I think maybe what people are getting at when they say bring your whole self to work is that there is space for you to not be okay. And I think where I cringe is the extreme example of somebody who comes in day after day, dumping baggage and drama on the people around them. And that you don't like when your friends do it, right? Mm-hmm. Like you want to be there when your friend has a bad day, but you don't want to be friends with somebody who's just dumping negativity on you all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think I'll maybe caveat what I said before with that addition, that there needs to be the safety that when you are having a bad day, that you can express that and you can get support for it in some way or another.
Mm-hmm. I think I 100% agree. I think what was challenging for me as an HR leader in the early days of the pandemic is that, particularly for the portion of our employee population that were maybe living with like multiple roommates in dense apartments in urban areas, or were living alone, that work was one of the few outlets, social outlets that folks had. There was this very rapid transition where work was a part of people's lives pre-pandemic to, in those especially quarantine early days of the pandemic, work for many people was all that they had. And so there was this very rapid transition of the expectation for that community and for what that place provided for you. And I think that there's still a lot of companies that are still trying to figure this out. And I'm not going to sit on this podcast and proclaim that I have some sort of secret answer to this. But there's a balance in there of what it is that we can reasonably provide as employers and what we should be providing versus what people should be searching out in other parts of their lives. And for us to then create benefit systems, create programs that encourage those types of things. And so I've been really excited to see the proliferation of mental health resources that have come into the workplace, right? Where it's not that we're gating some sort of mental health resource, but rather offering platforms, offering kind of staged programs, right? If you're just at a point where you need a simple resource like a Headspace or a Calm app or something like that, just to kind of, help move you through some thought processes that you're having versus, graduating to an EAP if you're having an emergency situation, or you have telehealth benefits through something like a Modern Health or Better Health, those types of options to be able to continue to support team members. But it's creating the systems, the programs for people to be able to access that are appropriate, but also not trying to be everything for everyone, because that's also not reasonable. And I would argue kind of a dangerous relationship for people to have with work, because it is still a working relationship, right? And that's, you need to have an appropriate balance there, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you for diving into that rabbit hole with me. I appreciate that. Mm-hmm. We'll dig our way back out here, and let's talk about building the employee base out. We know a few of the same people in the community, and I know a few folks who work at the companies that you invest in. And I had reached out to a few of them and asked for questions that they would be interested in having answered. And one of them relates to this topic of building out your team, which is that whether you're in that pre-seed A stage or whether you've gotten bigger and you're in more of that, you're like officially a startup, or you're even a scale up, what I would call a scale up phase. How do you recruit people when you don't have the money or the stability to offer, but you need good talent and you believe in what you're doing? Mm-hmm. What tips do you have for recruiting in that type of an environment?
Yeah, great question. So my brain first goes to a little bit of like a mindset that we need to come into this with. Specifically, you will hear me time and again talk about this concept of top talent and how much I hate it. I think that the top talent myth of this world is that there is some sort of creme de la creme on top of the employee workforce that is available that we're all chasing after. My honest response to that is that a software engineer who is highly productive at Google likely is not going to be highly productive at your 10-person startup. They are not going to have the same resources, support systems, tools, budget, access to be able to do the things they need to do. So I'm going to argue that as a business, you need to continually assess what does top talent look like for us today where we are and what it is that we need to do next. And so we talked already in our conversation here around, one of the pitfalls I see with founders is that they're either too far in the future or too close at hand. You have to have a balance of what is the near term, but also what is our North Star we're marching towards, right? So similarly with building your employee base, you need to think about like who is going to get us to where we need to go tomorrow. And then what is that going to continue to look like as we think 6, 12, 18, 24 months down the road here? Going to get off my soapbox about top talent here. So first mindset piece is like, there is not some sort of like perfect person in the world that you're missing. Rather, you need to be reflective of kind of where you are in the moment. Second is going to be honesty. You have to come into the recruitment conversation with an honest perspective and really helping candidates make the choice to join you. It's got to be a two-way street. So you're finding that candidate, you're doing the assessment, but you're giving them the information they need to make the informed choice to come and join you next. So that's kind of the second mindset piece. Actually putting that into practice, the ways that I've seen teams do it most effectively, one, early stage teams are able to win with speed. That's something that is going to be just point blank. Like you were able to beat the bigger tech companies in that regard. So move quickly, be decisive in your decisions, move forward, communicate that effectively. But second is being able to communicate what are the opportunities and what are the challenges that someone's going to face in the role or the company is kind of staring down. And we have an example of one of our portfolio companies where they hired an executive to lead a function that this person was wildly well suited for. They came from a parallel organization doing the exact same thing, and we were super excited about them. About 6 months in, this was their first time being at a startup of any kind. They've been in larger established organizations previously. About 6 months in, there was a board meeting where we're talking about run rate for the business and burn rate and what does the fundraising trajectory look like. And basically this person got very spooked by that because they hadn't been part of a conversation like that before. What I have to say is it's not that the executive team hadn't been honest about any of that. They'd answered all the questions, but it was this not meeting the candidate where they were at kind of thing that we realized we had missed in the process, that we should have kind of talked about like, hey, you're coming from this type of very established environment. You're going to be doing basically the same function here. And we think you're going to be really successful at it. But it's a very different company that you're doing it for. And so that person ultimately decided that they needed to step away from the business and go back to more of an established organization. So as I'm talking about this kind of honesty and transparency and moving with speed, that has to come with recognizing where is that candidate? What do they need to hear from you to make a confident step forward? And also that means sharing the parts of the reality that might not be a good match for them and making sure that they understand those choices, the trade-offs that they're making there as well.
So what do you say to somebody who goes like, yeah, that's great, Jim, but now we just lost out on a great candidate?
Yep. That means that they weren't top talent for you. They are not aligned to where you're at in the business, and the honesty of where you are at in your journey is my quickest response there.
Yeah. Short-term win for a long-term loss.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. I think the other mistake I see, and this is less on the recruiting side, more on the retention side, is that startups struggle to have the conversation with their early team members about the evolution of the business. I think that we can all kind of look at stories where you had someone that was early on and they, did a bunch of things. And then as more team members were hired, their role whittled down a little bit and they got kind of shifted to this department and shifted to that department. And so the ability for particularly a founder or CEO to be able to have an honest conversation with one of their early days team members about where that person's role is evolving and why, and being able to balance that conversation with appreciation for what that person had contributed. Ideally, what that person could contribute to the organization moving forward, but also the reality of if that's not exciting to you, we recognize that and we'll support your departure from the business as well. And so I think recruitment is as much an important part as it is that conversation after someone has joined the organization and continuing to inform your team about where you're at and what's going on. I think about some of the experiences I've had, especially when we got kind of north of, say, 100 employees. And you have that mix of folks that were there in those early days when it was, 10 people in a conference room together building this thing for the first time. And then that 100th employee that came in and they maybe stepped back from 1,000 person organization, right? And all of a sudden in one team, you have this very wide dichotomy of expectations, experiences, that kind of stuff. And so that's where I think that ongoing conversation when someone has joined is really important about where are we as a business and what does this look like and where are we going and what are the needs that we have and where can you continue to fit into that picture? And if not, being really human, very empathetic in the process of helping those folks be able to depart with dignity.
Yeah, thank you. Quick question. You've spoken there a lot about really humanizing the workplace. Like a lot of what you were just describing is really taking a human-centric approach to all of this. that can be really hard to do amidst the day-to-day operations of the business because it requires slowing down and thinking about each individual person and what they're going through and what they want. Is that best done through an HR leader? And if so, when is it appropriate to bring in an HR leader? Or is this just skill set that we should be building into all of our managers as the way that we do business?
That's a great question. I will say that I think it needs to live in every leader. I don't know that it naturally lives in every leader, though. We talked a little bit about building your executive team earlier and that balance of like values with functional expertise. I think this is probably a good point to bring that back up. That one of the functional expertise areas that your HR leader should have is this executive coaching component where they can support the other executives as they are navigating those human conversations within their given function. I think that an organization is in failure mode when anytime a person problem, and I'm going to put that in quotations here, a person problem comes up, that they go and tap HR. I think HR is at its best when they are a strategic partner to that executive, to that leader. And when I say strategic partner, I'm talking about not the tactical, how many candidates do we have in the pipeline for this role? And we have 3 performance reviews to do next week. All of that has to happen, like create the systems to communicate that stuff for sure. But when I feel like I've been at my best as an HR leader is when I was sitting across from one of my peer leaders, peer executives, helping them think through how they were going to approach a challenging conversation with a team member or helping them really understand the impact of, an organizational shift or change. Or I think a lot about like product and technical teams as we grew. We kind of went from like one just kind of like large product technical team to like multiple product and technical teams. And how do they communicate with each other? And how do we shift people between those teams? And each of those teams starting to get their own individual identities or personalities. And is that okay? And what does that look like? And stuff like that. My best days are when I'm partnering with one of my peer leaders, helping them think through those kinds of questions. That's the strategic HR perspective that I think needs to be there. For an early stage business, it's a good question of like, when does that start to shift? I guess the best corollary I can think of quickly is like when you transition sales from founder-led sales to a leader in some capacity. Typically, the way that sales evolves is you have founder-led sales and then you bring in your first, say, account executive who's starting to do most of the tactical kind of day-to-day selling, but the founder is still leading the function, right? And then you have an evolution where you bring in a sales leader that takes over that mantle from the founder at that point. I think of HR somewhat similar. Typically, that first hire I see is what I describe as a recruiter plus. So someone that's really focusing on bringing people into the organization. That plus part being that they're flexing into the employee experience a little bit, right? They're not just getting the offer letter signed and then passing it off to the office manager or the COO or finance manager, whoever it is, be like, great, we've hired someone, go run with it. But rather that recruiter is managing the process of onboarding and getting people up and running with systems and stuff like that. That you're kind of thinking about that. So that's that first person in the HR function, but the founder or maybe the COO is still kind of fully running the function. And then as you kind of get to the point where the volume of requests are coming in, you're recognizing it's becoming a bigger portion of your day. That's when it's about time to start bringing in that HR leader. I would also say that it comes with having a couple of other leaders on the team. I rarely see the HR leader being one of the first executives brought in. I think that's appropriate. I think that there are other functions that you need to have a leader on, probably because the founder doesn't have enough expertise or it's a hard thing to outsource. There's a fair amount of people operations you can outsource for a period of time through a PEO or other similar relationship. Or that there are some really fantastic fractional HR leaders that are available on the market right now that if anyone is in need of one, reach out to me. I'm happy to connect you to a few that I absolutely love. But you can get someone for 10 hours a week that you get that strategic piece and you just need to hire a tactical person that's doing a lot of the stuff on a day-to-day basis, right? And so I think the HR should come a little bit later. I think you'll have a couple other leaders on the team and that you start to see the need versus just feeling like it's a thing that you're supposed to do.
Yeah. Likewise, I know some good fractional HR leaders as well. So happy to help with that for anyone listening. I got one more question for you because I know we're running out of time, but talk about diverse talent pipelines or funnels, because what you said, this top talent thing's a myth. That's great. I feel like a lot of the talent pipelines that are out there are geared towards pulling in what we would consider maybe as top talent right now. And yet with the push for DEI, with other things that are going on in the workforce that are making it tough to get talent in certain markets, how are you seeing companies evolve the funnels that they're using to get different types of talent maybe they weren't looking at before. That could be different skill sets, different racial groups, different sexual preference, demographics, I don't know, whatever it is, but just to go to people that they weren't targeting otherwise.
Yeah. I think a couple of kind of thoughts there. I think first and initially, especially in early stages of business, most recruiting is typically done within your network. Plenty of studies show that a person's network looks very much like them. And so I think initially there is an intentionality, it's before you even start the recruiting, there's an intentionality on the part of executives, on founders, on recruiters and recruiting leaders to make sure that they are actively trying to build a diverse network that they can tap into when they have roles and opportunities. Second, I think that there is a continued, it's funny, this kind of ebbs and flows with the market and kind of what's going on, but this continued shift towards skill-based hiring versus pedigree-based hiring. So whether that is that you are, stripping things, identifying information like name and stuff like that out of a resume, you are removing schools, but you're just leaving the degrees that were achieved, or you're shifting to just being kind of a skill-based assessment for a role. I think that is a big piece here. I was talking to one of our HR leaders actually earlier today. We were talking about a couple of departures that they'd had and brainstorming about like what could be going on here, what's happening. And the kind of strategy we created, he's going to go implement, but the strategy that he created was around kind of a duality of making sure that we are assessing existing organization, but also thinking about like, what is the prototype that we're looking for especially replicating roles, a role that you're going to hire multiple of in the next kind of insert time period. And that we have the alignment of the clarity on and the alignment on what is it that this role is going to need to do for the business and being able to clearly communicate that to candidates. And so doing that in job descriptions, skill assessments during the interview process, stuff like that. But kind of back to my core point here, I think it's this continued shift to a skill-based environment versus a pedigree-based environment. I think the last thing to remember is that as your team grows, things like employee resource groups, business resource groups, whatever term you're applying to them, are wildly helpful in being able to both retain the talent that you have and also to be able to bring in new talent. That comes with empowering those groups and the leaders of those groups to be able to go out in the world and do the things that you're asking them to do, right? I think that I've seen a number of failures in this type of work where these groups are created and then immediately tasked with, great, now double the number of folks who identify within this community. And it's whatever the metric is that they're putting on top of it. I don't think that that's the way to go about it. It has to be much more authentic and real than what that implies. Yeah. Giving folks the space and the authenticity to be able to say, this is my experience, and I would encourage others to come have the same experience with me. But that should come with some balance of communicating who this space is not right for. What about this space is not going to be the right match for them? I think that's where, I think that's where I see a lot of folks kind of fail on this, like on the diversity front, is that we need to make sure that we are mitigating bias through all of our processes. We need to build cultures and environments where folks from a whole variety of backgrounds and experiences are going to be successful, but also the clarity. For myself, for example, I don't think that I would be particularly excited about working in, say, like a high frequency trading firm. It's just not an environment that I think I would enjoy. The way I've come to understand that is because I've had friends that work in that space be able to communicate to me what that experience is like, what those environments are like. I'm like, that's not my style. And that's okay, right? But it's not reflective of some part of me not being accepted there. And admittedly, most of my characteristics identify with majority settings, right? And so just thinking about someone that comes from a background that is underrepresented in a given space, you need to make sure that person really understands well what their experience is going to look like or potentially going to look like so that they can make the informed choice of whether or not that's the right next step for them.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And just before we wrap up the show here, I have a question that I ask most of the guests who come on as kind of the finale. Given the nature of what you do, who you do it for, I think I'm excited to hear your answer to this. But what in your mind is the purpose of business?
That's a great question. All right, I'll say the thing. I think that business should empower us to live the lives that we want to live. That we should have something to show up to on a day-to-day basis that we feel energized by, that we feel excited by, bought into, because that thing is helping us to live the lives that we want to live. So I would say that it's the work to live, not the live to work, would be my answer to that. But that's where that's what I think the purpose of business is.
I love it. I love it. That's fantastic. And I love asking that question because I think we often are so consumed by our work that we often stop to ask, what's the point of this whole exercise in the first place? So I love that. Jim, this is fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on the show. This was action packed. We crammed a lot in here. You talk pretty quick. So this is a dense episode.
I do. I apologize. That is one curse that I do have, is I do talk fast. So I hope everyone was not listening on 2 times speed today.
The benefit of this format is people can go back and listen as many times as they need to really unpack it. So Jim, thank you for coming on and appreciate you sharing your wisdom here.
Beautiful. Brian, glad to be here today. Hope to have the opportunity to come back again in the future.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.